In this part, we'll look a little bit more closely at some of the engineering functions of the SeaBrick and its kind of topology. This time focusing on the circles here. So you see these little grooves that are created when we have a number of SeaBricks coming together. So that has a purpose and several purposes. It serves several purposes. So for example, the first purpose is when these bricks are together in a system. Well, this is somewhat floppy, you know. So we don't necessarily want that in a structure. So we can lock the layers by putting in this case here we have a spring. This is a steel spring. And the usefulness of that is that it can be a shock absorber. So as if there's a pressure force on the bricks, it compresses. And so without actually the bricks even touching, they are able to absorb force. And you can imagine that, you know, if each column of bricks is connected with other columns by these springs, then the whole structure becomes capable of absorbing significant force. And the gap between the bricks is 2% of the width of a brick. So that's a 2% give. It's not insignificant. So we have these ability to use this groove for kind of springs. A different use case would be something more rigid. You know, sometimes we want maybe for a building or a deck. So here's a more rigid version. It's just a disc with some grooves made to fit in the hole here. So this can be pressed in, and that will make it will enforce kind of a placement of the bricks relative to each other, and also this 2% gap becomes much more clear because it's being created by the disc. And so this is a fairly rigid way of combining them together. And you can do this, you know, in other areas as well. So this is a double height one, so that if you put a layer of bricks on top of that, they will also lock. And so you can see that this whole structure has become quite rigid. Now, interesting that it just popped up, because this opens the opportunity for the next conversation, which is, you see there's a metal nut here, very small nut. And so what's possible is to combine these discs on the bottom with discs on the top to create quite rigid structures. So here we have one where we have a disc on the top, a disc on the bottom, and they're connected by a threaded bolt. And this, you can imagine how this might happen at scale. You would just have tension cables, you know. In this case, I just use a threaded bolt just because of this size, but in larger things, you would have tension cables, very simple, which would connect the layers together. And this one, you have another one over here, disc on the bottom, double disc on the second layer, and it's rigid. The structure is actually quite rigid. So unlike the other blocks, which were, you know, very wavy and capable of absorbing, you know, force, this would be more appropriate for a building where there might be decking or a ceiling or a floor or a beam. So you can create these rigid structures. And you can imagine that if we have 3 or 4 layers of these, they'll become significant, quite rigid. And so that is, and as well, you see that now we have this rigid structure, and this could be a substructure inside a larger building made with, you know, in some areas there may be springs, and some they may be just loosely held to each other. But you see that we have this gap, this 2% gap in between. So this, if we had a pile of these like a wall and it went on, we could pour epoxy or some kind of resin in the cracks and let it seal, and, you know, prevent it from flowing out by sealing the edges. And then we would have an impermeable wall. So obviously it would be much thicker than the hulls of a ship, which are made of steel. You know, that might be just a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch of steel. This would be, you know, several feet, probably at least 1.5 meters. But it would be relatively light for its size and much cheaper than steel. And so you can, and for a large vessel like a barge, you can imagine the utility of that, or even creating internal pontoons for a floating building. You have to create buoyancy, and although the bricks themselves are lighter than water, you could use this ability to seal rigid substructures to create air cavities inside a substructure to a building, a floating building, or a floating infrastructure, floating structure, to create extra buoyancy. So I think you could probably get 4 to 5 times as much buoyancy per SeaBrick by creating internal cavities, likely in the shape of hexagons. Actually, it's the most effective shape for strength and creating internal cavities. So just one more point to mention. So here we see, this side is one layer, and then it's truncated. But in this side, we have the bolt, or the tension cable going up 2 layers. So this gives us an opportunity to demonstrate what it looks like if there's 2 layers. So here we have another brick, and we can go up here, connected with this one. And then it fits right in like that. And you can take another disc, you can screw it in. And that will create kind of this tension situation that will squeeze the bricks together. There. And now that is on rigidly. All right. So you see that as you do this layer on layer, and create more tension points, it's getting tighter. Oh gosh, in creating a highly compressed structure, in the same way as with concrete, where you have, cables under tension inside the concrete to create a compressive pull from the top or bottom or sides to increase the strength. You can do the same with the SeaBrick using these cables to create the tension. So it's the same principle with concrete, but with the SeaBricks.